The dust of redemption. Arizona territory. Tasted of grit and failed promises. It settled in the folds of Clara DeWitt's wedding dress, a fine white cotton garment her father had paid for with the last of his savings, a final investment in his daughter's security. The dress felt like a shroud. Inside the small, sun-bleached church, the air was thick with the scent of dry timber, sweat, and the faint, cloying sweetness of the wild desert blooms Martha Gable had insisted on placing in clay pots by the altar. Clara stood beside Thomas Gable, the man who was, in a matter of moments, to become her husband. He was the son of the territory's most prosperous rancher, a fact that was repeated with the reverence usually reserved for scripture. Thomas was a solid man, built like the land he worked, broad, sun-weathered, and quiet. He was not unkind, but his eyes held no poetry, only the practical assessment of livestock, fences, and the woman who would now manage his home. Theirs was a marriage of acreage and alliance. Her father, a man broken by drought and debt, needed the Gable connection to survive. Thomas Gable needed a wife to bear sons and lend a veneer of respectability to his growing empire. Love had not been part of the negotiation. Clara stared past the Reverend Michael's balding head, through the open church doors, to the endless expanse of pale earth and shimmering heat. She felt a profound and terrifying loneliness, a sense that her life was now a story being written by others. She had dreamed of a different life, one filled with books and conversation, perhaps even a gentle love that grew slowly, like a sturdy desert pine. Instead, her future stretched out before her as barren and predictable as the landscape itself. "Do you, Clara DeWitt, take this man, Thomas Gable, to be your lawfully wedded husband?" The Reverend's voice droned, pulling her from her thoughts. She felt the eyes of the small congregation on her back. Her father, his face a mask of anxious hope. The Gables, stern and proprietary. A few dusty townsfolk who had come for the novelty and the promise of free whiskey at the reception. Clara's throat was dry. She swallowed the dust, the loneliness, the resignation. "I do," she whispered, the words barely audible above the hum of a persistent fly. Thomas's hand found hers. His skin was rough, calloused, the grip strong and possessive. It felt less like a lover's touch and more like a brand. He said his own vows in a clear, steady voice, the voice of a man making a sound business deal. As he slid the simple gold band onto her finger, a sudden, unnatural silence fell outside. It was not the familiar quiet of the afternoon heat. It was a dead quiet. The chirping of insects ceased. The distant lowing of cattle stopped. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. A horse whinnied somewhere down the street, a sharp, panicked sound. Then came the scream. It was high and thin, cut short with a sickening abruptness. Before anyone in the church could move, the world exploded into chaos. The first gunshot shattered the stained glass window above the altar. A depiction of a shepherd and his flock, now a spiderweb of broken, colored light. Shouts erupted outside, not in English, but in the harsh, guttural tongue that every settler in the territory had learned to fear. Apache. The church doors burst inward. Townsfolk who had been lingering outside stumbled in, their faces pale with terror, followed closely by the lithe, dust-smeared figures of the raiders. They moved with a terrifying speed and purpose, their faces painted for war, their eyes hard and empty of mercy. Thomas reacted as a rancher's son would. He pushed Clara behind him, his body a shield, and reached for the pistol he always wore at his hip. It was a brave, foolish gesture. He was a man accustomed to fighting cattle and weather, not the whirlwind of calculated violence that had descended upon them. He cleared the holster, but before he could raise the weapon, a warrior was on him. There was no grand struggle, no heroic last stand. There was only the blur of a raised war club and a sickening crunch of bone. Thomas Gable fell without a sound, his eyes wide with a final, uncomprehending surprise. A splash of crimson stained the white lace on Clara's sleeve. She looked down at her husband of less than 5 minutes, at the ruin of his face, and her mind simply stopped. The sounds of the massacre, the screams, the shots, the splintering of wood, faded into a dull, distant roar. She stood frozen, a statue in a white dress, as the world she knew was systematically dismantled around her. She saw Reverend Michael fall, his Bible clutched to his chest. She saw Martha Gable dragged from beneath a pew, her cries silenced with a casual brutality. Smoke began to fill the small church, acrid and choking. The air tasted of gunpowder and terror. Through the haze, a figure emerged, moving toward her. He was taller than the others, his body lean and corded with muscle, his skin the color of baked earth. His face was a harsh sculpture of sharp angles and old scars, and his long, black hair was held back by a simple leather band. But it was his eyes that held her. They were as dark and deep as a starless night, and in their depths, she saw a weariness that seemed as ancient as the mountains themselves. He carried a rifle in one hand and a long knife in the other. He did not look at her with the feverish bloodlust she saw in the others, but with a cold, detached assessment. He was looking at a prize. Another warrior, younger, his face alight with a savage grin, reached for her, his hand tangling in her veil. "This one," he said in his own language, his voice rough. "The bride." The taller warrior spoke a single, sharp word. It was not a request, it was a command. The younger man's hand fell away instantly, and he backed away, his grin replaced by a look of sullen obedience. The tall warrior stepped forward. He did not touch her face or her body. He grabbed a fistful of her dress at the shoulder, the fabric tearing under the force of his grip. He began to pull her, dragging her from the chaos of the church, over the bodies of her neighbors, and out into the blinding, smoke-filled sunlight. Clara did not fight. She could not. Her limbs were numb, her mind a hollow chamber of shock. She stumbled along behind him, her wedding slippers skittering on the bloody dust. The town of Redemption was burning. The general store was a pyre, its flames licking at the indifferent blue sky. Bodies lay scattered in the street like broken dolls. The raid was brutally efficient, designed for maximum terror and speed. They had come for horses, guns, and supplies, and they had taken them, leaving a butcher's bill in their wake. The warrior, the one they called Kohana, threw her unceremoniously toward a captured horse. He bound her wrists in front of her with a strip of rawhide, pulling it tight enough to bite into her skin. He tore a piece from her petticoat and fashioned a crude gag, stuffing it in her mouth and tying it securely behind her head. The taste of dusty cotton filled her mouth, stifling the scream that was finally beginning to build in her throat. He lifted her as if she weighed nothing and set her astride the horse, then mounted behind her, his hard body pressing against her back, one arm locking around her waist like an iron bar. With a sharp cry, he spurred the horse forward, and the war party galloped out of the ruins of Redemption, leaving the smoke and the dead to the silence and the vultures. The journey was a descent into a waking nightmare. The sun beat down, a merciless hammer against her skull. The landscape shifted from the dusty plains around Redemption to a brutal, unforgiving wilderness of rock and thorn. They rode through bleached canyons where the walls seemed to lean in, threatening to crush them, and across high mesas where the wind howled a constant, mournful song. The land was vast, empty, and hostile, a place that cared nothing for human suffering. Clara was a prisoner of motion, her body jolting and swaying with the rhythm of the horse. The arm around her waist was a constant, unyielding pressure. She could feel the heat of Kohana's body through the thin fabric of her dress, could smell the scent of horse, sweat, and something else, something wild and faintly of wood smoke. He did not speak a word, either to her or to the others. He rode with a grim, focused intensity, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon. She was property now, less than human. The other warriors would sometimes ride close, their dark eyes lingering on her white skin and torn dress, their words a low, mocking murmur. She did not understand what they said, but she understood the tone. It was the sound of contempt, of ownership. Each time, Kohana would shift slightly, a subtle movement, or utter a low sound in his throat, and they would fall back. He was not protecting her out of kindness. She felt that instinctively. It was the action of a man protecting his claim. She was his, to do with as he pleased, and he would not suffer another to touch what belonged to him. The thought offered no comfort, only a different, colder kind of fear. Days bled into one another, marked only by the rising and setting of the relentless sun. The nights were worse. A profound, chilling cold descended from the mountains, seeping into her bones. They would make camp in sheltered ravines, the fires small and carefully hidden. She would be given a piece of dry meat and a sip of water from a skin, just enough to keep her alive. She was kept bound, tied to a scrub tree or a saddle, a few feet from the circle of warriors. She watched them, their faces illuminated by the flickering firelight. They would talk in low tones, their expressions hard and unreadable. They were not monsters. That was the most terrifying part. They were men, forged by a land and a history she could not comprehend. And in their eyes, she saw the reflection of the same hatred her own people bore them. Kohana remained a silent, imposing enigma. He treated her with a complete, almost contemptuous indifference. He checked her bonds each night, his touch rough and impersonal. He shoved food and water at her without a word. He was not cruel, but his distance was a form of cruelty in itself. He rendered her invisible, a piece of cargo, a burden he was forced to transport. One afternoon, as they crossed a wide, rocky wash, Clara's horse stumbled, sending her tumbling to the ground. She landed hard, the air driven from her lungs, her head striking a stone. For a moment, the world went black. When her vision cleared, one of the younger warriors was standing over her, the one who had tried to grab her in the church. He reached down and hauled her to her feet by her hair, a cruel laugh on his lips. Pain exploded in her scalp. Before she could even cry out, Kohana was there. He moved like a striking snake. He did not shout. He simply grabbed the other man's wrist, his fingers digging in. The warrior's face contorted in pain, and he released her immediately. Kohana held his gaze for a long moment, a silent, deadly promise passing between them. Then he shoved the man away and turned to Clara. He pulled her upright, his grip on her arm bruising, and pushed her back toward the horse. He did not look at her face, did not check to see if she was injured. He was merely restoring order, putting his possession back in its place. The journey ended in the high country, a hidden village nestled in a deep canyon, protected by towering walls of red rock. The shelters were not tents, but wickiups, domed structures made of branches and hides that blended almost seamlessly with the earth. The arrival of the war party brought the village to life. Women, children, and old men emerged, their faces a mixture of relief and curiosity. The spoils were displayed: guns, ammunition, sacks of flour, and her Clara, the white bride in her filthy, tattered dress, was the most curious prize of all. The women stared at her, their expressions a mixture of scorn and hatred. One of them, an old woman with a face like a dried apple, spat on the ground at Clara's feet. Children pointed, their dark eyes wide. She was an omen, a ghost from the enemy world. Kohana ignored them all. He pulled her through the village, past the curious and hostile stares, to a wickiup that stood slightly apart from the others, near the edge of a steep drop-off. It was smaller than the rest, stark and simple. He cut the bonds on her wrists with a flick of his knife. The blood rushed back into her hands in a wave of tingling pain. Then he shoved her inside. The interior was dark and smelled of smoke, leather, and dry herbs. A small, dead fire pit sat in the center. A few furs were piled against one wall. It was the dwelling of a man who lived alone. Clara stumbled to the dirt floor, her legs finally giving out. The last of her strength, the last of her shock-induced numbness, drained away, leaving her hollow and trembling. This was it. This was the end of the journey. The indifference, the cold protection on the trail. It was all a prelude to this moment. Alone with him in his shelter. All the horror stories she had ever heard, whispered among the women in redemption, flooded her mind. She knew what was supposed to happen now. The fate of a captured woman. Kohana stood in the entrance, a dark silhouette against the dying light. He watched her for a long moment, his face unreadable. He still held the knife in his hand. A terrible primal fear seized her, so powerful it almost stopped her heart. But beneath the fear was a layer of utter exhaustion. She was tired of being afraid, tired of being hungry and cold, tired of the pain in her bruised body. She was tired of living in this new, brutal world. She looked at the hardened warrior, at the weapon in his hand, and she saw not a tormentor, but a possible end to her torment. Her voice, when it came, was a ragged, broken thing, a sound she did not recognize as her own. She pushed herself up onto her knees, the torn white fabric of her dress pooling around her in the dirt. She looked him straight in the eye, and the tears she had held back for days finally began to fall, tracing clean paths through the grime on her cheeks. "Please," she begged, her voice cracking. "If you are going to do what you mean to do, please, just make it quick." She closed her eyes, waiting for the cold sting of the blade, the final, brutal violation. She waited for the end. Silence. The only sound was the wind, whistling through the cracks in the wickiup's frame. She held her breath, every muscle in her body tensed. A long moment passed, then another. She heard a soft clatter. Slowly, hesitantly, she opened her eyes. Kohana had not moved toward her. He stood in the exact same spot. But the knife was no longer in his hand. It lay on the ground by his feet, its blade dull in the twilight. He was staring at her, but the cold assessment was gone from his eyes. In its place was something she could not name, a deep, profound weariness that seemed to pull at the very bones of his face. He looked like a man who had carried a mountain on his shoulders for 1,000 miles and could not take another step. He looked at her, the crying, pathetic symbol of his enemy, and saw not a prize, not an object of revenge or lust, but another broken thing in a world full of broken things. He let out a long, slow breath, a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of every man he had ever killed, every loss he had ever suffered. Without another glance, he turned his back on her and walked out of the shelter, leaving her alone in the growing darkness. Clara stared at the empty doorway, her mind reeling. He was not what she expected. He was not the savage from the stories. He was quiet. He was tired. And she was beginning to realize with a dawning, terrifying clarity, utterly and completely alone. Later that night, he returned. He did not look at her, did not speak. He built a small fire in the pit, the flames pushing back the chill and the shadows. He left a piece of cooked rabbit and a small bowl of water near her before settling on the far side of the fire, wrapping himself in a single fur. He lay with his back to her, a silent, unmoving shape. Clara did not touch the food. She sat huddled in the corner, clutching the tattered remains of her wedding dress. The thin gold band on her finger felt as heavy as a stone. The wind picked up outside, rattling the mountains, its mournful cry the only sound in the vast, dark wilderness. It was the sound of her own heart, enclosed in the fragile warmth of the firelight, surrounded by an enemy people, under the guard of a man who spared her life for reasons she could not fathom. Clara DeWitt finally wept. Her sobs were silent, swallowed by the wind, as she grieved for a husband she had not loved and a life she had never wanted but had now lost forever. Kohana watched the white woman sleep, in the flickering firelight of his wickiup. Her face was pale and still, stripped of the terror that had contorted it for days. She slept the deep, bottomless sleep of the utterly exhausted, her breathing a soft, rhythmic whisper against the constant moan of the wind outside. He saw the faint, dark circles beneath her eyes, the chapped texture of her lips. She was fragile, a hothouse flower transplanted to the heart of the desert, and he wondered at the foolishness of her people, who seemed to think their softness was a strength. He looked at her and did not see Clara DeWitt. He saw a ghost. He saw the face of his wife, Ayanna, as she had looked on the morning they had gone to the peace talk at Willow Creek. Her name had meant eternal blossom, and she had been as bright and resilient as the small, tough flowers that clung to the canyon walls. He had believed the soldiers that day. He had looked into the smiling face of their captain, a man with eyes the color of a faded blue sky, and accepted his words of friendship, his promises of blankets and salted meat for the winter. Ayanna had been hesitant. "Their words are easy," she had said, her hand resting on his arm. "Their hearts are not." But he had been a young man then, full of a desperate hope for an end to the running, an end to the bloodshed. He had convinced her it was safe. "We will take Nita," he had told her. "Let our daughter see the day the fighting ends." Nita, his daughter. She had been 5 winters old, with her mother's bright eyes and his own stubborn chin. Her name meant bear, for the strength he had hoped she would one day possess. That morning, she had clutched his hand, her small fingers lost in his, and chattered excitedly about the candy the soldiers sometimes gave the children. The memory was a sharp, clean wound, a place in his soul that never healed. It played in his mind not as a story, but as a series of stark, silent images. The soldiers laughing as they handed out thin, worn blankets. The sudden, coordinated way they raised their rifles. The sound of Ayanna's gasp beside him. The first scream, not of pain, but of pure, uncomprehending betrayal. He remembered pushing Nita behind him, a useless gesture against a storm of lead. He remembered the blank, efficient expressions on the soldiers' faces as they fired into the crowd of unarmed men, women, and children. They had not been fighting warriors. They had been exterminating pests. He had survived by some cruel twist of fate. A bullet had grazed his temple, knocking him into a ditch where he lay unconscious among the dead. When he awoke, the soldiers were gone, and the silence was broken only by the buzzing of flies and the weeping of the few other survivors. He had found Ayanna and Nita near the creek bed, their bodies tangled together as if in a final, desperate embrace. He had never forgiven himself. He had led them there. His hope had been their death sentence. From that day forward, the world had become a different place. The color faded from the sky, the warmth from the sun. His heart had become a cold, hard stone in his chest. He fought not for hope or for a future, but for revenge. He had killed many white men since that day, soldiers and settlers alike. He had burned their ranches and stolen their horses. Each act of violence was a prayer to the ghosts of his wife and daughter, a testament to his unending grief. But it brought no peace. The hollow space inside him only grew larger. Now, this woman, another man's bride, slept in his lodge, a living symbol of everything he had lost and everything he had come to hate. And he did not know what to do with her. For Clara, the days in the Apache camp were a lesson in invisibility. She was less than a ghost. She was a curse, a walking embodiment of bad medicine. The initial hostility of the villagers settled into a pattern of sustained, silent contempt. She learned to walk with her eyes fixed on the ground, to make herself as small and unnoticeable as possible. The women were the worst. They would turn their backs when she approached the stream for water, their conversation ceasing until she had filled her small clay pot and retreated. Sometimes, a well-aimed gob of spit would land in the dust just beside her foot. They spoke of her in harsh, whispering tones. And though she did not understand the words, she understood the name they had given her, the White Omen. Her fine wedding dress was a distant memory, a foolish dream. Kohana had tossed her a simple tunic and leggings made of soft, worn deer skin. They were practical, warm, and utterly foreign. Wearing them felt like a final surrender of her old identity. She was no longer Clara DeWitt, daughter of a struggling merchant, bride of a dead rancher. She was a captive in an enemy camp, dressed in the clothes of her captors, her future a blank, terrifying void. Kohana remained a distant, forbidding presence. He protected her with a cold efficiency that offered no comfort. When a group of young boys began to circle her, their taunts growing bolder, Kohana emerged from his wickiup. He said nothing. He simply stood and watched them, his arms crossed over his chest, his face an unreadable mask. One by one, the boys fell silent and slunk away. He had saved her from their torment, but he had not offered her a single word of reassurance. He provided her with food, leaving it by the fire as one would leave food for a stray dog. He never ate with her. He never looked her in the eye. He slept on the opposite side of the small shelter, a world away in the darkness. His silence was a wall she could not penetrate. It was more intimidating than any threat. She began to understand that she was not a person to him. She was a responsibility, a problem he had not yet decided how to solve. He was keeping her alive, but he was not letting her live. The loneliness was a physical ache, a constant pressure behind her ribs. She was surrounded by people, yet she had never felt so completely alone. The first snow came without warning. One morning, the sky was a sheet of flat, gray metal, and by afternoon, thick, wet flakes were drifting down, blanketing the canyon in a silent shroud of white. The cold deepened, biting and raw. For the villagers, it was a time to retreat to their lodges, to mend clothes and tell stories by the fire. For Clara, it was a chance. The idea of escape had been a constant, flickering ember in her mind. But where could she go? The wilderness was a death sentence. Now, looking at the snow, the ember flared into a desperate, reckless flame. The snow would cover her tracks. It would slow any pursuit. It was a terrible risk. But the thought of another day, another week, another season of this living death was more terrible still. Death in the snow seemed a cleaner, more honest end than whatever fate awaited her here. That evening, a woman, whose son had been killed in a skirmish months earlier, blocked Clara's path as she returned from the stream. The woman's face was a knot of grief and rage. She unleashed a torrent of furious words, her voice raw with pain, and shoved Clara hard. Clara stumbled backward, spilling the water, and fell into the snow. The woman stood over her, her eyes burning with a hatred so pure it was almost beautiful. Kohana's voice, sharp and low, cut through the air. The woman froze, then spat one last word at Clara before turning and stalking away. That was the moment the decision solidified. Kohana had saved her again, but it was not his protection she wanted. She wanted freedom, or she wanted the grave. She waited until the camp was deep in sleep, until the only sounds were the crackle of dying fires and the soft hiss of the falling snow. Kohana was a still shape in the darkness of the wickiup. She moved with a slowness born of sheer terror, each movement a silent prayer. She slipped out of the lodge and into the storm. The cold was a physical blow, stealing her breath. The snow was already calf-deep, and the wind drove it into her face, blinding her. She had no idea which direction to go. She only knew she had to get away. She pushed forward, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs, expecting at any moment to hear a shout, to feel a hand grab her shoulder. But there was nothing. Only the howling of the wind and the deep, consuming white. She walked for what felt like hours, a numb automaton plunging through a frozen hell. Her deerskin clothes, which had seemed so warm in the village, were no match for the storm. The cold seeped through, chilling her to the bone. Her face was numb, her feet and hands turning into clumsy, aching blocks of ice. She lost all sense of time and direction. The canyon, the trees, the entire world had disappeared, replaced by the swirling chaos of the blizzard. She did not know how long she had been walking when she heard it. The low, angry murmur of moving water. A river. She stumbled toward the sound, her mind foggy with cold and exhaustion. The bank was a steep, snow-covered slope. Her foot slipped. She tried to catch herself, her frozen fingers grasping at the empty air. And then she was tumbling, rolling through the snow, until she plunged into the shocking black cold of the river. The icy water was a brutal awakening. It engulfed her, 1,000 knives stabbing at her skin. The current was strong, a malevolent force that grabbed her and pulled her under. She thrashed, her lungs burning, her limbs heavy and useless. The will to live, which she thought had been extinguished, flared one last time. She fought her way to the surface, gasping for air, her head breaking through the churning, ice-choked water. She saw the snow-covered bank, just a few feet away, and tried to swim toward it, but the cold had sapped her strength. Her body refused to obey. The current pulled at her, dragging her downstream. The darkness began to close in at the edges of her vision. She thought of her father, of the dusty church, of Thomas Gable's surprised face. It all seemed so distant, a story about someone else. This was the end, a quiet, cold drowning in the middle of nowhere. She closed her eyes and let the river take her. Kohana knew she was gone before the cold spot where she had been sleeping had fully faded. He had been tracking men and animals his entire life. He could read a landscape like a man could read a book, and he knew the foolishness of a white woman who thought a snowstorm could hide her. He felt not anger, but a weary sense of inevitability. He pulled on a heavy buffalo robe and stepped out into the storm, his rifle in hand. He found her tracks easily, already half filled with new snow. He followed them with a steady, loping stride, his movements economical and sure. He was not racing against the storm. He was a part of it. He saw where she had stumbled, where she had pushed through a thicket of brush. The tracks led, as he knew they would, toward the river. He saw the slide mark on the bank, the disturbed snow leading down to the black water. He scanned the river, his eyes sharp and practiced. 100 yards downstream, a dark shape was snagged on the branches of a fallen tree, bobbing weakly in the current. He reached her in moments, wading into the thigh-deep, freezing water without hesitation. She was unconscious, her face as white as the snow, her lips blue. He pulled her from the tree's grasp and hauled her from the river. She was a dead weight in his arms. For a moment, he thought he was too late. He pressed his ear to her chest and heard it, a faint, fluttering beat, as fragile as a trapped bird's wing. He carried her back to the camp, his own body shivering with a cold that went far deeper than the river. He pushed into his wickiup and laid her gently by the fire pit. He worked with a silent, focused urgency, piling wood onto the embers until a roaring fire filled the small space with heat and light. He cut the frozen clothes from her body and wrapped her in the thickest, warmest furs he owned. He rubbed her hands and feet, trying to force life back into the frozen limbs. He brewed a strong, bitter tea from herbs and forced a few spoonfuls of the warm liquid between her lips. And then he sat back and waited, watching her, listening to the storm howl its rage outside. Clara woke slowly, swimming up from a deep, black place. Her first sensation was warmth, a profound, penetrating heat that seemed to soak into her very bones. She felt heavy, wrapped in something soft and impossibly comfortable. She heard the crackle of a fire and the relentless shriek of the wind. She opened her eyes. She was in Kohana's wickiup. The fire was blazing. She was cocooned in a mountain of furs. She was alive, a wave of despair, so powerful it was nauseating, washed over her. She had failed. She had chosen death, and he had dragged her back to this life. All her effort, all her suffering in the storm, had been for nothing. She pushed herself up, the furs falling away. Kohana was sitting across the fire from her, watching her. His face was grim, his eyes dark and shadowed. He looked as tired as she felt. The question tore from her throat, a raw, ragged sob. "Why?" she cried, the tears she thought had frozen inside her now flowing freely. "Why did you do it? Why didn't you just let me go? I wanted to die!" She collapsed back into the furs, her body racked with a grief too deep for words. She had tried to take control of her own fate, and even that had been taken from her. Kohana watched her for a long time, his expression unchanging. The silence stretched, filled only by her weeping and the storm. She did not expect him to answer. He never answered. But then he spoke. His voice was low and rough, as if it had been rusted by disuse. "I am tired of blood," he said, the words simple, yet carrying the weight of a lifetime. He stared into the flames, his gaze distant, as if seeing things only he could see. "Too much blood, on my hands, on the earth, on the snow." He fell silent again, and Clara's sobs subsided into quiet, hitched breaths. She watched him, waiting. "When you knelt in this lodge," he continued, his voice barely a whisper, "and you asked me to make it quick, I saw the faces of my wife and my daughter. I saw all the people at Willow Creek, the soldiers. They did not make it quick for them." He finally looked at her, and for the first time, she saw past the hardened warrior, past the stoic captor, and into the man beneath. His eyes were filled with a pain so vast and so old it seemed to have no end. "I do not know why I spared you," he said, his voice raw with a weary honesty. "I brought you here for revenge, a white bride for my dead wife. But when I looked at you, I could not. The killing, it has hollowed me out. There is nothing left inside. Maybe I did not want to be a killer anymore." He had not saved her. He had saved himself. In that moment, something inside Clara shifted. The hatred she had nurtured, the fear that had been her constant companion, began to dissolve. She looked at this man, this enemy who had stolen her life, and she saw not a savage, but a man drowning in his own grief. His loss was different from hers, vaster and more violent, but it was loss all the same. They were two people from warring worlds, bound together by a shared and profound suffering. He had lost his family to her people. She had lost her future to his. They were both broken, both alone. The storm raged on outside, a wild and violent thing, but inside the small, warm lodge, the air was still. The animosity that had defined their existence had evaporated, leaving a quiet, empty space. Kohana reached for a piece of roasted venison that was warming by the fire. He broke it in two and held a piece out to her. It was not a command. It was an offering. Slowly, her hand shaking, Clara reached out and took it. She sat up, pulling the furs around her shoulders, and began to eat. He ate his own piece, and for the first time, they shared a meal. They did not speak. There were no words for the chasm that still lay between them. But as they sat by the fire, sharing food while the blizzard howled, an uneasy peace began to form in the quiet space where their hatred had once been. The great snow melted as slowly as the ice in Clara's heart. It receded first from the sun-scoured rocks, then from the canyon floor, leaving the earth damp, hungry, and smelling of new life. The uneasy peace that had settled between Clara and Kohana in the wake of the storm began to change, transforming from a simple absence of hatred into something more complex, a fragile and unnamed accord. The silence between them, once a weapon, became a language of its own. Time, which had been her enemy, became a neutral territory. The days fell into a rhythm dictated not by fear, but by necessity. Kohana began to teach her the ways of his world, not with the patient instruction of a teacher, but with the terse, practical guidance of a survivor. He would point to a plant, its leaves a pale, fuzzy green, and utter its Apache name, followed by the single English word he knew for its purpose, medicine. He showed her which roots were safe to eat, how to dig for them with a sharpened stick, and which berries would bring a swift and agonizing death. He taught her how to read the clouds, to feel the shift in the wind that heralded rain, and how to find her way by the unblinking stare of the North Star. She learned to cook thin stews of rabbit and wild onion over the fire, stretching their meager supplies with a skill that surprised them both. She was a clumsy student at first, her hands soft and unaccustomed to the hard work of survival, but she was a determined one. She learned because her life depended on it. In return, she offered him the only thing of value she had left from her old world. The raid that had destroyed her life had, by a strange twist of fate, also provided a means of connection. Tucked into a small deerskin pouch she had made was a single, battered book, its cover torn, its pages warped by moisture. A small Bible, salvaged from the floor of the burning church. She had kept it not out of piety, but as a tangible link to a world that no longer existed for her. One evening, as he sharpened his knife by the fire, she took it out. His eyes flickered toward it, a spark of curiosity in their dark depths. She opened it to the first page and pointed to the large, ornate letter. "In," she said, her voice soft, "in the beginning." He watched her, his expression unreadable. She pointed to the next word, And so, their lessons began. Each night, by the flickering light of the small fire, she would teach him. They would sit closer than they ever had before, the open book a bridge between them. Her finger would trace the black letters, and his deep, low voice would stumble over the strange, angular sounds of the English language. He was a quick learner, his mind sharp and his memory long. He learned the names of things first: man, woman, sky, fire, water. Then he learned the words that connected them. Their communication slowly grew beyond simple gestures and single words. It blossomed in the shared silences, in the way he would leave a rare, sweet cactus fruit for her by her sleeping furs, in the way she would ensure the water skin was always full before he left to hunt. It grew in the small, fleeting smiles that would sometimes touch his lips when she pronounced an Apache word correctly, and in the long, lingering glances they would exchange across the fire when they thought the other was not looking. They were two solitary creatures, orbiting each other in the quiet wilderness, slowly, cautiously, learning the gravity of the other's presence. But their fragile peace was contained within the small circle of their firelight. The village remained a place of suspicion and scorn. The other warriors watched Kohana with a mixture of respect for his skill and contempt for his new, strange softness. They saw him spending time with the white woman, saw the way he no longer treated her as a slave, but as something else. It unsettled them. It was a crack in the old certainties. The confrontation, when it came, was as sudden and violent as a summer thunderstorm. Clara was gathering firewood near the edge of the camp when a warrior named Nakai approached her. He was young, ambitious, and carried a deep-seated bitterness toward the white settlers who had killed his father. He saw Clara not just as an enemy, but as a symbol of Kohana's weakness. "The great warrior spends his nights teaching the white ghost to speak," Nakai sneered, his words in Apache, but his tone universally insulting. He stepped closer, deliberately blocking her path. "Has she taught you how to weep like a woman, Kohana?" Kohana appeared as if from the earth itself, moving with a silent, deadly grace. He placed himself between Clara and Nakai, his body a solid, immovable shield. "She is not your concern," he said, his voice dangerously low. Nakai laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "She is a disease in this camp. You were once a great killer of them, now you are their pet. You shame your ancestors. You shame the memory of your wife." The mention of his wife was a line crossed, a flicker of pure, unadulterated pain crossed Kohana's face. So swift that Clara almost missed it. But before he could react, something inside Clara snapped, The fear she had lived with for so long was suddenly burned away by a hot, bright flash of rage. This man, this stranger, knew nothing of the quiet, wounded man who shared his fire with her. "Leave him alone!" The words burst from her, loud and sharp in English. Both men turned to look at her, their expressions stunned. She stood her ground, her fists clenched, her chin high. "You are the one who brings shame," she shouted, her voice trembling but clear. "He is a better man than you will ever be." Nakai's shock turned to fury. He saw her defense not as an act of bravery, but as the ultimate insult. A white captive, his property, daring to speak for him. He lunged, not at Kohana, but at her. He never reached her. Kohana moved with a speed that was terrifying to behold. He did not draw his knife. He did not reach for his rifle. His response was one of brutal, restrained violence. He caught Nakai's wrist, twisting it at an unnatural angle. There was a sickening crack of bone. Nakai howled in pain. Kohana drove a fist into his face, the impact a solid, meaty thud. Nakai staggered backward, blood pouring from his nose. Kohana was on him in an instant, grabbing the front of his tunic and lifting him from the ground before slamming him back down into the dirt. He knelt over the younger warrior, his forearm pressed against Nakai's throat, his face a mask of cold, controlled fury. "Touch her again," Kohana whispered, his voice a lethal rasp, "and I will send your spirit to the crows." He held him there for a long, tense moment, the entire camp watching in silent fascination. Then, with a grunt of disgust, he released him and stood up. He turned, grabbed Clara's arm, and pulled her away without a word, marching her directly to their wickiup. He began to gather his few possessions, his weapons, a buffalo robe, a small pouch of dried meat. "We are leaving," he said. It was not a question or a suggestion. It was a fact. The village was no longer a sanctuary. It was a threat. They left under the cold gaze of the setting sun, two outcasts walking away from the only world he had left. They traveled for 2 days, moving deeper into the mountains, into a silence more profound than any Clara had ever known. They finally stopped at a place Kohana seemed to know, a small, dilapidated cabin tucked into a narrow, pine-choked valley. It had been built years ago by a white trapper, long since dead or gone, and the wilderness was slowly reclaiming it. The roof sagged. The single window was a gaping hole, and the wind whistled through the gaps in the log walls. It was a brutal, unforgiving place. There was no warmth but what they could make with their own fire. Food was scarce, a constant, nagging worry. They spent their days hunting and foraging, their nights huddled together for warmth. But in the stark, quiet isolation of the valley, there was a strange and profound peace. There were no scornful eyes, no mocking voices. The judgment of the world could not reach them here. There was only the wind in the pines, the cry of a hawk, and the steady, reassuring presence of each other. One evening, they returned to the cabin after a long, fruitless day chasing the ghost of an elk through the high country. They were cold, hungry, and exhausted. As Clara slid from the back of their shared horse, her foot slipped on a patch of icy mud. She fell hard, her hand landing on the sharp edge of a broken axe head that lay half buried in the dirt. Pain, white-hot and immediate, shot up her arm. She cried out, cradling her hand to her chest. A deep, ragged gash stretched across her palm, welling with dark, crimson blood. Kohana was at her side in an instant. He gently took her wrist, his expression a mixture of concern and something else she could not quite read. He led her inside the cabin and sat her down by the fire. He tore a clean strip of cloth from his own shirt and, after rinsing the wound with precious water from their skin, began to bind her hand. His touch, which had once been so rough and impersonal, was now impossibly gentle. His large, calloused fingers moved with a deft, careful precision, cleaning the cut, applying a poultice of crushed herbs, and wrapping the bandage securely but not too tightly. He worked in complete silence, his focus entirely on her hand. Clara watched him, her breath caught in her throat. She could feel the warmth of his skin, the steady strength in his hands. The pain in her palm was a dull throb, but it was overshadowed by a new and overwhelming sensation, a feeling of absolute, unequivocal safety. When he was finished, he did not release her. He kept her small, bandaged hand cradled in his own. She was trembling, from the cold, from the shock, from the sudden, powerful wave of emotion that was washing over her. She leaned against him, her head finding the solid warmth of his shoulder, the rough deerskin of his tunic soft against her cheek. She had to tell him. The truth was a physical weight inside her, and she could no longer bear it alone. "I am scared," she whispered, her voice so quiet it was almost lost in the crackle of the fire. "Every day, I am scared of the cold and the hunger. I am scared of the silence and of what will happen to us." She took a shaky breath and looked up, her eyes meeting his in the firelight. "But I am not scared of you, not anymore." His gaze was intense, searching. He saw the truth of her words in her wide, tear-filled eyes. He saw the fragile trust she was offering him, a gift more precious than any prize. Slowly, as if moving in a dream, he raised her bandaged hand to his lips. He pressed a soft, hesitant kiss to her knuckles, a gesture of such reverence it made her heart ache. Then he lowered his head, his face drawing closer to hers. He was unsure, his movements tentative, asking a question without words. She did not pull away. She closed her eyes, and his lips met hers. It was not a kiss of passion or demand. It was a soft, searching touch, as gentle and as careful as the way he had bound her hand. It tasted of wood smoke and winter and a sorrow too deep for words. It lasted only a moment, and then he pulled back, their foreheads resting together, their breaths mingling in the cold air. The desire was there, a low, simmering heat that had been building between them for weeks. But they did not act on it. The moment was too fragile, too sacred to be broken. Outside, a lone wolf cried to the moon, its voice a long, haunting call that echoed through the silent valley. Inside the small, broken cabin, they prepared for sleep. They lay down on the single pile of furs, side by side, closer than they had ever been before. They did not touch, but an invisible current flowed between them, a bond forged in violence and loss, now tempered by a quiet, burgeoning tenderness. In the heart of the vast, unforgiving wilderness, they were no longer captor and captive. They were simply a man and a woman, unable and unwilling to part. The days that followed were spun from a new and delicate thread. The raw, brutal necessity of survival was now interwoven with a shy, unspoken tenderness. They moved around the small, drafty cabin not as captor and captive, but as two people learning the quiet rhythms of a shared life, a life lived on the very edge of the world, where the only laws were the changing of the seasons and the beating of their own hearts. The unspoken desire that had sparked between them the night he bound her hand did not erupt into a fire, but glowed steadily, a warm and constant ember in the cold solitude. It was in the way his eyes would follow her as she mended their clothes by the fire, in the way she would save the best piece of meat for him when he returned from a hunt, weary and empty-handed. It was in 100 small, silent gestures that spoke a language louder than words. The change came one night when a late winter storm descended upon their valley, a final, furious gasp of the dying season. The snow fell in a thick, silent curtain, erasing the world and enclosing their small cabin in a soft, white cocoon. The wind, which had been their constant tormentor, fell silent. The world seemed to hold its breath. They sat by the fire, the only sound its cheerful crackle. They had eaten, a meager meal of dried meat and boiled roots, and a deep, peaceful quiet settled over them. Kohana was carving a piece of wood, the knife moving with a slow, practiced grace in his hands. Clara watched the firelight play across the harsh angles of his face, softening the scars, warming the deep, dark sorrow in his eyes. In that moment, he was not a warrior, not an Apache, not the man who had dragged her from the ruins of her life. He was just a man, lonely and tired, seeking a little warmth in a cold world. He looked up, as if feeling her gaze, and their eyes met. The piece of wood fell from his hands. He reached across the small space between them and gently touched her face, his calloused thumb tracing the line of her jaw. It was a question, a plea, and a promise all at once. She leaned into his touch, her eyes closing. He moved from his side of the fire to hers, his movements slow, deliberate, giving her every chance to pull away. She did not. When he knelt before her, she raised her hands and framed his face, her fingers tangling in his long, black hair. She saw everything in his eyes then, the ghosts of his wife and daughter, the long years of killing and grief, and the new fragile hope he had found here, with her. He lowered his head and kissed her, and this time there was no hesitation. It was a kiss of deep, aching need, a kiss that spoke of long nights and lonely days, of shared hardship and a dawning, impossible love. He lifted her in his arms as if she weighed nothing and carried her to their shared bed of furs. He laid her down gently, his body covering hers, a warm, solid weight that felt not like a trap, but a shield, beneath the soft, thick blanket of the newly fallen snow. Inside the small, broken cabin, they finally came together. It was not a collision of passion, but a tender, unhurried exploration. Every touch was a discovery, every caress a form of healing. He learned the soft curves of her body. She learned the hard, scarred landscape of his. They moved together with a quiet reverence, two broken halves of a single soul finding their way back to each other in the darkness. Afterward, they lay tangled in the furs, their bodies slick with sweat, the firelight dancing on their skin. Clara felt a peace so profound it was almost painful. She was home, this desolate cabin, this harsh wilderness, this enemy warrior, this was her home now. She nestled her head in the hollow of his shoulder, listening to the steady, strong beat of his heart. She remembered that first, terrifying night in his lodge. She remembered her desperate plea. A small smile touched her lips, a smile born of a sorrow that had finally found its comfort. "Please," she whispered into his skin, the words a soft echo of a nightmare now past. "Just make it quick." She felt his body tense for a moment, and then a low rumble of sound vibrated through his chest. It was a sound she had never heard from him before. He was laughing, a quiet, deep, and utterly beautiful laugh. He rolled onto his side, pulling her closer, his dark eyes shining with a light she had never seen. "I won't," he said, his voice soft and full of a gentle, happy promise. He kissed her forehead, her eyelids, the tip of her nose. He held her longer, tighter, as if to prove his words, as if he would never let her go. And for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, she laughed with him, the sound bright and clear in the quiet cabin. In the days that followed, a new and precious thing bloomed between them. Hope. It was a fragile seedling pushing its way through frozen ground. But it was there. They began to talk of the future, their words quiet, almost superstitious, as if speaking too loudly might frighten it away. "When the spring thaw comes," he said one afternoon, his eyes on the high, snow-covered peaks, "we will cross the mountains, to the north. The soldiers do not go there." "We could build a cabin," she added, her voice full of a wonder she had not felt since she was a child. "A real one, with a floor and a window that has glass." "Near water," he agreed, a small smile playing on his lips. "And a place to plant." "We could have a garden," she dreamed, corn and squash, maybe even some flowers. They were simple, humble plans, the dreams of ordinary people for a brief, shining time. In their isolated valley, they allowed themselves to believe they could be ordinary. They were no longer a white woman and an Apache warrior. They were just Clara and Kohana, two people building a new world out of the ashes of the old. But the world they had fled had a long memory. A lone Apache hunter, tracking a mountain lion, stumbled upon their valley. He saw the smoke from their cabin, saw the white woman moving freely, saw the way Kohana looked at her. He returned to the village with a story that spread like wildfire. Kohana, the great warrior, the avenger of Willow Creek, had not only spared the white bride, he had taken her for his own. He had betrayed his people. He had betrayed the memory of his ancestors. He had chosen an enemy over his own blood. The retribution came on a cold, gray morning. Clara was outside, gathering the last of the edible roots from a patch of ground where the sun had melted the snow. When she heard the sound, it was the crunch of many feet on frozen earth. She looked up, and her heart turned to ice. A group of a dozen Apache men were walking down the trail into the valley. They were painted for battle. At their head was a man whose face was a harder, younger version of Kohana's. It was Taza, his cousin. She screamed his name, a raw cry of warning. "Kohana!" The cabin door flew open, and he was there, his rifle in his hand. He took one look at the approaching warriors, at their set faces and drawn weapons, and his own face became a grim, stony mask. He knew what this was. Taza stopped a few feet from the cabin, his eyes burning with a cold, righteous fury. He did not look at Kohana. He looked at Clara. "So, this is the white witch who has stolen your soul. Cousin," he said, his voice like the scrape of rock on rock. "She has stolen nothing," Kohana replied, his voice dangerously calm. "Go back to the village. Taza, this is not your fight. You made it our fight when you brought this stain into your lodge." Another warrior snarled. "You have forgotten your wife. You have forgotten your child." "Do not speak their names," Kohana warned, his knuckles white on the stock of his rifle. "He is no longer one of us," Taza declared, his voice ringing with judgment. "He is a traitor. The woman is a curse. We will cleanse this valley of them both." Two of the warriors suddenly broke from the group, charging not at Kohana, but at Clara. She had no time to run. They were on her in an instant, dragging her to her feet. One of them backhanded her across the face, the blow stunning her, filling her mouth with the coppery taste of blood. They threw her to the ground and tied her hands and feet with cruel efficiency, the rawhide biting deep into her skin. Kohana roared, a sound of pure, animal rage, and raised his rifle, but he could not shoot. The other warriors had formed a half circle, their own rifles leveled, their arrows notched. Taza stepped forward, a long knife in his hand. "You will not die the quick death of a warrior, cousin," Taza said, his voice dripping with contempt. "You will fight for your white prize, and you will die like the dog you have become." It was not a battle. It was a slaughter. Kohana was outnumbered, but he fought with the desperate, cornered fury of a wolf protecting its den. He used his rifle as a club, a blur of motion, breaking a man's arm, cracking another's skull. He moved with a speed and ferocity that drove them back, but they were too many. A thrown tomahawk caught him high on the shoulder, slicing deep. A spear thrust gashed his thigh. He stumbled, his movements becoming slower, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Clara watched, helpless, her screams muffled by the dirt. She saw him falter, saw Taza move in, his knife flashing, with a final, desperate surge of strength. Kohana drove his own blade into the belly of a warrior who had gotten too close. The man grunted, his eyes wide with surprise, and fell. The sudden death seemed to shock the attackers. They had not come for a fair fight, but for an execution. They had not expected this level of resistance. They had not expected to die. Taza looked at his fallen comrade, then at the wounded, bleeding but still defiant Kohana. He had proven his point. "Leave him," Taza spat. "Let him bleed out in the snow with his witch. The cold and the wolves will finish our work." With that, they turned and left, their footsteps fading into the gray silence of the morning. For a long moment, there was no sound but the whisper of the wind and Kohana's harsh, pained breathing. He stood swaying for a second, then collapsed to his knees. His first act was to crawl to where Clara lay, his blood leaving a dark trail in the snow. His fingers, clumsy with pain and exhaustion, fumbled with the knots of her bonds. "Clara," he gasped, his voice a thread of sound. "You must run! Go, before they come back!" He finally freed her hands. She did not run. She scrambled to her knees and threw her arms around him, her tears falling hot on his cold skin. "No," she sobbed, her voice fierce. "I am not leaving you. I will never leave you." She helped him stumble into the cabin, his arms slung over her shoulders, his weight a heavy, agonizing burden. She eased him down onto the furs and looked at his wounds. They were bad. The gash on his shoulder was deep, and his leg was bleeding freely. He was shivering, his face pale and slick with sweat. For the second time, she became his nurse. But this time it was not the cold she was fighting, but death itself. Her hands, which had once been so soft and useless, now moved with a desperate, shaking purpose. She tore strips from her own tunic, washed the wounds as best she could, and packed them with the last of their medicinal herbs. She built the fire up until it roared, trying to fight the chill that was settling deep into his bones. He was drifting in and out of consciousness. In his delirium, he spoke the names of his wife and daughter. He spoke of the son, and of a time before the killing. Clara cradled his head in her lap, whispering to him, her words a constant, soothing stream. "I am here, Kohana. I will not leave you. We will be safe." As darkness fell, she knew they could not stay. Taza was right. They would be back, or the wolves would come. They had to leave. "We have to go," she said, her voice firm. When he opened his eyes again, "Now, under the cover of night." He shook his head weakly. "I cannot walk." "Then I will carry you," she declared, her resolve as hard as iron. She dressed him as warmly as she could, then dressed herself. She packed what little they had, a waterskin, a handful of dried meat, his knife. She helped him to his feet, his body a dead weight against hers. And then she became his crutch, his shield, his protector. They stumbled out of the cabin and into the darkness. Just as they cleared the valley, a new snow began to fall. Not the soft, gentle flakes of their night together, but a thick, heavy, blinding curtain of white. It covered their tracks, but it also sapped their strength, each step a monumental effort. Kohana could barely walk, his wounded leg dragging, his body racked with fever. Clara looped her arm around his waist, pulling him along, her own small frame straining under his weight. The roles were now completely reversed. The captor had become the captive, and the captive had become the savior, dragging him forward into the unforgiving, storm-tossed wilderness. The snow did not relent. It was a merciless, suffocating blanket, and the world had become a churning vortex of white. Clara moved through it like a ghost, her own body a distant, aching thing. The only reality was the weight of Kohana against her, a weight that grew heavier with every step. He was a dead weight of fever and pain, his consciousness a flickering candle flame in the blizzard. She did not know how long they walked. Time had dissolved into a single, agonizing effort. One more step, just one more. Her own strength was failing. The cold was a physical entity, a predator stalking them through the storm, sinking its teeth deep into her bones. Her vision was blurring, the white void around her beginning to sparkle with strange, dark lights. "This is how it ends," she thought, with a sense of calm detachment. Not in a raid, not by a knife, but quietly, frozen into the landscape. 2 lost souls swallowed by the snow. It was then that she saw it, a light. At first, she thought it was a delusion, a final trick of her freezing mind. But it did not fade. It was a small, steady, yellow square, impossibly warm and real in the swirling chaos. A lamp in a window, it was a promise of life. The last 100 yards were the longest journey of her life. She was no longer walking. She was crawling, dragging Kohana's unconscious body behind her, her raw hands leaving bloody trails in the snow. She reached a solid wall of logs, the source of the light, and pulled herself up. With the last of her strength, she beat her fist against the rough-hewn door, the sound a pathetic, muffled thud. She beat it again and then collapsed, the darkness finally taking her. The door was opened by a man with a face like a weathered map. His beard shot through with gray, his eyes a pale, cautious blue. He looked down at the heap on his doorstep, a half-frozen woman in tattered deerskin and the bloody, unconscious form of an Apache warrior, and his hand went instinctively to the shotgun that leaned against the doorframe. "Silas, for heaven's sake, don't just stand there gawking." A woman's voice, sharp but not unkind, came from within. She appeared behind him, a small, bird-like woman with gray hair pulled into a tight bun and eyes that had seen too much sorrow to be shocked by anything. She took in the scene with a quick, practiced glance. "They are nearly frozen. Bring them in, now." Silas hesitated, his eyes locked on Kohana's face, on the dark hair and the harsh warrior's profile. "Martha, that's an—" "He is a man. Silas." She cut him off, her voice firm. "And he is dying, the same as her. Are you going to let them die on our doorstep because of the color of their skin? After what happened to our Jacob?" The name hung in the air between them, heavy and sad. Silas's face softened, the caution replaced by a familiar ache of grief. He sighed, a cloud of steam in the frigid air, and nodded. Together, they carried the 2 strangers inside, out of the storm and into the warm, lamp-lit air of the trading post. Clara awoke to the smell of wood smoke and brewing coffee. She was lying in a real bed, a soft mattress stuffed with corn husks, under a thick pile of patchwork quilts. A fire crackled in a stone hearth nearby. For a moment, she was utterly disoriented, believing she had died and woken in some strange, warm afterlife. Then the memory of the snow, the cold, the desperate flight, came flooding back. She sat up with a gasp. "Kohana!" "He is alive." The voice was Martha's. She was sitting in a rocking chair by the fire, a mending basket in her lap. "Barely. My Silas is tending to his wounds. The man has a strong spirit, but he has a bad fever." Clara looked at the older woman, her heart pounding. This was the white world again, a world of suspicion and instant judgment. She had to be careful. "Thank you," Clara whispered, her throat raw. "You saved us." Martha looked at her, her gaze steady and searching. She took in Clara's pale face, the blue-black bruise on her cheek, the raw, chapped skin. She saw the fear in her eyes, but also a fierce, protective resolve. "Who are you, child?" she asked, her voice gentle. "And who is he?" The lie came to Clara's lips without a moment's thought. It was not a lie. She realized it was the deepest truth she knew. She pulled the quilt tighter around her shoulders and met the old woman's gaze. "My name is Clara, and that man, he is my husband." Martha's expression did not change. She did not raise an eyebrow, did not show a flicker of surprise or disbelief. She simply nodded slowly, her eyes drifting from Clara to the other room, where she could hear her husband's low murmurs. She had seen the way the girl's first word upon waking had been his name. She had seen the way the man's hand, even in his delirium, was fisted in the deerskin tunic she had been wearing. Whatever the truth was, it was their own, and she would not be the one to tear it from them. "Well, Clara," she said, her voice soft, "you had best get some rest. Your husband is going to need you when the fever breaks." For a week, the trading post was a quiet infirmary. Silas, a man who had seen his share of wounds from both sides of the conflict, set Kohana's shoulder and stitched the gash in his leg with a grim competence. Clara and Martha worked together, brewing bitter teas to fight the fever, cleaning the wounds, and forcing broth between his lips. In his delirium, he spoke in his own tongue, his words sharp and angry, then soft and full of sorrow. Clara would sit by his side for hours, her hand on his forehead, her own voice a low, constant murmur, as if her presence alone could anchor him to the world of the living. Martha watched them. She watched the way Clara's face would soften when she looked at him, the way she would touch his hand when she thought no one was looking. She saw the terror in her eyes when his breathing grew shallow, and the profound relief when the fever finally broke. She saw the way his eyes, when he finally woke, clear and sane, searched for Clara first, a silent question passing between them that needed no words. She saw two people who had been through a private hell and had come out the other side bound by something stronger than blood or law. It reminded her, with a painful, bittersweet ache, of her son Jacob and the young bride he had left behind. In that small, isolated outpost, for a fleeting, precious moment, they had peace. As Kohana's strength returned, the small cabin behind the main trading post became their world. For the first time, Clara felt something she had not felt in years, hope, untainted by fear. The future, which had been a terrifying void, began to take on a soft, hazy shape. They talked for hours, their voices low in the quiet evenings, their plans taking root like the first green shoots of spring. They would follow the mountains north, as he had said. They would find a hidden valley, build a small, sturdy cabin by a clear stream. He would hunt and fish. She would plant a garden. "I will build you shelves for your books," he said one night, his voice still weak but steady. He had made a remarkable recovery, his body's resilience a testament to a life lived in a hard land. Clara smiled, a real, untroubled smile. "What books? All I have is the one." "We will find more," he promised, his hand finding hers in the firelight. The world outside, with its hatreds and its laws, seemed a distant, half-forgotten dream. Their reality was the warmth of the fire, the taste of fresh bread Martha would bring them, the quiet companionship. It was a fragile, borrowed time, but they lived in it as if it were a lifetime. One afternoon, Kohana sat outside their cabin, the pale winter sun on his face. He had a piece of soft, pale wood in his hands, and his knife, which had taken a life, was now being used to create one. He carved with the same intense focus he brought to everything, the wood shavings falling like snow at his feet. Clara watched him from the doorway, her heart full. Later that day, he came to her. He said nothing. He simply took her left hand, the one that still bore the faint, white scar on the palm, and slipped a ring onto her fourth finger. It was the piece of wood he had been carving, shaped into a perfect, smooth circle, the grain of the wood a swirling, intricate pattern. It was more beautiful to her than any ring of gold or diamond. Tears welled in her eyes, hot and sudden. They were not tears of sorrow or fear, but of a joy so profound it was painful. This was her wedding. This was her truth. She looked from the simple wooden ring to his face, and in his dark, steady gaze, she saw her future. He had no words for what he felt, but he did not need them. He had carved his heart and laid it in her hand. She threw her arms around his neck and wept, and he held her, his hand stroking her hair, a silent, comforting presence against the overwhelming tide of her emotion. Their peace was shattered by the sound of approaching horses. It was a sound that every person in the territory had learned to interpret. It was not the slow, plodding gait of a farmer's wagon, nor the scattered rhythm of a band of Indians. It was the steady, disciplined, and purposeful beat of trained cavalry, of men who rode with a singular, unyielding purpose. Silas came to their cabin, his face pale and grim. "Rangers," he said, his voice low. "A whole patrol of them. They are asking questions in the post about an Apache raid on a town called Redemption, about a kidnapped bride." The fragile world they had built shattered into 1,000 pieces. The outside had found them. Clara felt the old, familiar coldness seep into her veins. Kohana stood up, his face becoming the stoic, impenetrable mask of the warrior. The brief, happy dream was over. He took her hand, his grip firm and steady. "You will tell them I forced you," he said, his voice quiet and urgent. "You will tell them you were my prisoner. They will not punish you if they believe you are a victim." "No," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "I will not." "Clara, you must," he insisted, his eyes pleading. "My life is already forfeit. Yours is not. You will survive this." Before she could argue, the door to their small cabin was kicked open. A man in the uniform of a Texas Ranger stood there, a pistol in his hand. He was tall, with a sunburnt face and cold, emotionless eyes. Behind him, other Rangers fanned out, their rifles ready. Well, the Ranger said, a slow, cruel smile spreading across his face. He looked at Kohana. Then his eyes flickered to Clara, taking in her deerskin clothes, the wooden ring on her finger. "Looks like we found our nest." He spat on the floor. "Sergeant Miller, we have been looking for you, boy, and for the poor, unfortunate Mrs. Gable." Kohana stepped in front of Clara, shielding her with his body. He raised his hands slowly, showing they were empty. "She is not to be harmed," he said, his English clear and steady. "She was my prisoner. She did as she was told to survive. Let her go, and I will come with you peacefully." Miller laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "That is mighty noble of you, but the law has its own ideas about a white woman shacking up with a savage. She will have her day in court, same as you will have yours at the end of a rope." "He is lying," Clara's voice rang out, sharp and clear. She pushed past Kohana, planting herself firmly in front of him, her small body a defiant shield. She looked Sergeant Miller straight in the eye, her own gaze burning with a fury he did not expect. "He did not take me. He saved me." Miller's smile vanished. He looked at her as if she were insane. "Ma'am, you have been through a terrible ordeal. Your mind is confused." "My mind has never been clearer," she shot back, her voice ringing with the force of absolute truth. "The men who killed my husband, who burned my town, they were killers. This man saved my life. He protected me. He is my husband." She held up her hand, displaying the simple wooden ring. Sergeant Miller stared at it for a moment, his face a mask of pure, uncomprehending disgust. It was, to him, the final proof of her degradation. He had come to rescue a victim and had found a traitor to her own kind. "That is enough," he snarled, his patience gone. "Shackle the buck! Take the woman!" Two Rangers surged forward. They grabbed Kohana, twisting his arms behind his back with a brutal efficiency. He did not resist. He knew it was useless. They slapped the cold, heavy iron of shackles on his wrists. Another Ranger grabbed Clara, his rough hands bruising her arms. "No!" she screamed, fighting against him. Her eyes locked on Kohana. "You cannot do this! He has done nothing wrong!" Her pleas were ignored. One of the Rangers, angered by Kohana's stoicism, slammed the butt of his rifle into his stomach. Kohana grunted in pain and doubled over. Clara's screams turned into a wild, incoherent cry of rage and despair. She was dragged from the cabin, her feet stumbling in the dirt. She saw them throw Kohana onto a horse, his hands bound, his face already bleeding. They threw her onto another. As the patrol began to ride out, leaving the silent, grieving figures of Martha and Silas in their wake, Clara turned to look back at him one last time. He was slumped in the saddle, bloodied and beaten, But he straightened up and met her gaze. His face was a mask of pain, but his eyes were clear and full of a fierce, desperate light. They held a single, powerful message, a final command that cut through her terror and despair. Survive. The return to redemption was a journey into a graveyard. The town Clara had left in flames was now a place of ashes and whispers, a community not rebuilt but scarred over. The physical structures had been partially repaired, new, raw lumber patching the burned-out face of the general store, a canvas sheet covering the shattered window of the church, but the spirit of the place was broken. Men walked with their eyes on the ground, and the women, when they spoke at all, did so in hushed, fearful tones. She was brought back in a buckboard wagon, a prisoner in all but name, and deposited on the steps of her father's modest home. He looked at her not with the relief of a parent whose lost child has been found, but with the weary, downcast shame of a man whose prized livestock has been ruined. She was no longer Clara DeWitt, the hopeful daughter, nor was she Clara Gable, the respectable widow. She was something other, a creature who had crossed a forbidden line and returned tainted. The town's judgment was a silent, suffocating thing. It was in the way old friends would cross the street to avoid her, the way the women would pull their children close as she passed, as if she carried a contagion. They saw her not as a survivor of a brutal attack, but as a willing participant in her own defilement. The story the Rangers had told, of a woman defending her captor, had twisted in the telling, becoming a lurid tale of betrayal and depravity. In their eyes, she was soiled, ruined, a delusional woman who had lost her mind in the wilderness and sided with the very monsters who had destroyed their lives. Only Martha Gable ever spoke to her directly, the older woman, her face a mask of cold, unyielding grief, confronted Clara in the street one morning. "They say you called him your husband," she said, her voice devoid of all emotion. "The savage who murdered my boy, my Thomas." "He did not kill Thomas," Clara said, her own voice quiet but steady. "And he saved my life." Martha Gable's face contorted in a brief spasm of pain. "You are either a liar or you are mad," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Either way, you are dead to me. You are dead to this town." Clara was utterly alone, a ghost haunting the ruins of her own past. But she was not broken. The final look in Kohana's eyes, that fierce, desperate command to survive, had become her armor. She was no longer the frightened girl who had stood at the altar. She had been forged into something new in the heart of the wilderness, something harder, something that would not break. She had a purpose. Her days fell into a new, grim rhythm. Every morning she would walk to the sheriff's office, a small, dusty building that now served as the town's jail. Every morning. Sheriff Brody, a man with a drooping mustache and tired, prejudiced eyes, would tell her to go home. "Ma'am, there is nothing to be done," he would say, not unkindly, but with the weary finality of a man reciting a script. "He is a federal prisoner now. He confessed to the raid." "He only confessed to protect me," she would insist, her voice ringing with a truth no one wanted to hear. "He is not a murderer. Release him." The sheriff would sigh and shake his head. "You need to forget him. Mrs. Gable, you need to let this go. He is an Apache. He killed our people. The circuit judge will be here in a month, and he will be tried and hanged. That is the beginning and the end of it." She wrote letters. She wrote to the territorial governor, to the army command, to anyone whose name she could find who might hold some sway of power. She told them the truth, her words a desperate, eloquent plea for the life of a man who had shown her a mercy her own people now denied her. She received no replies. Her letters, she knew, were likely being used to light cigars in some far-off office. The town watched her crusade with a mixture of pity and contempt. They saw a woman clinging to a fantasy, defending the devil himself. They did not understand that she was not just fighting for his life. She was fighting for her own, for the only part of it that still held any meaning. Weeks passed. The whispers grew that Kohana was not being held for the circuit judge at all. The Rangers, it was said, were not known for their patience with the due process of law. They had taken him to the old army stockade a few miles out of town, a place from which prisoners rarely returned. The fear that had been a low hum in Clara's heart now became a screaming siren. They were not waiting to hang him. They were letting him die, starving him, beating him, letting him rot in the dark. Desperation is its own kind of fire. It burns away all fear, all hesitation, leaving only the hard, unyielding core of purpose. Clara knew then that the world of laws and letters would not save him. If he was to be saved, she would have to do it herself. She had nothing left of her old life, save for a few keepsakes her father had stored, a silver-backed hairbrush, a small, pearl-handled music box that played a tinny, cheerful tune, her mother's gold locket, one by one. She sold them to a traveling merchant, the transactions feeling like small, necessary deaths. The last to go was the simple gold wedding band Thomas Gable had placed on her finger. She felt a pang of guilt, but it was fleeting. That ring represented a life that was never hers, a future that had died before it had ever begun. The simple wooden ring Kohana had carved for her was still on her finger, hidden beneath a leather glove. That was the one that mattered. With the small handful of coins she had collected, she began to watch the guards at the stockade. There were two of them, bored, disgruntled soldiers who hated the territory and their assignment. One of them, a young corporal named Finch, had a telltale flush to his cheeks and a constant thirst. Every evening he would ride into town and spend his meager pay at the saloon, returning to his post late, his steps unsteady. She found him there one night, hunched over the bar, staring into a glass of cheap whiskey. She sat down beside him. He looked at her, his eyes bleary, a flicker of recognition dawning. He knew who she was, the crazy widow. She did not waste time with pleasantries. She slid a stack of coins across the sticky bar. "That is for a bottle of your best whiskey," she told the bartender. Then she turned to Finch. "And this," she said, pushing the rest of her money toward him, "is for you, to look the other way for 10 minutes. Tonight." Finch stared at the money, then at her face. He saw not a madwoman, but a woman with a will of iron. He saw the coins, more than he made in 2 months. He thought of the cold night, the miserable duty, the Apache prisoner who was as good as dead anyway. He drained his glass, his Adam's apple bobbing. "The storm is coming in," he slurred, his eyes on the money. "Thunder is loud, distracting." He scooped the coins into his pocket. 10 minutes. After midnight. The key to the outer gate hangs by the door of the guardhouse. The cell key that you are on your own for. The storm rolled in just before midnight, as if summoned by the sheer force of her will. The sky, which had been a clear, star-dusted black, was now a roiling cauldron of dark, angry clouds. The wind began to howl, and the first fat drops of rain splattered in the dust. Clara, hidden in the rocks overlooking the stockade, pulled her cloak tighter and waited. She saw Finch stumble back to his post, a heavy bottle clutched in his hand. She saw him speak to the other guard, who soon retreated into the small guardhouse to escape the coming deluge. She saw Finch take a long pull from the bottle and then slump against the stockade wall, his head lolling on his chest. This was her chance. She moved through the darkness, a shadow among shadows. The rain began to fall in earnest now, a cold, driving sheet that plastered her hair to her face and soaked her to the skin. A flash of lightning illuminated the scene, a stark, black-and-white photograph of the sleeping guard, the silent stockade. The thunder that followed was a deafening cannonade, covering the sound of her footsteps. The key to the outer gate was where Finch had said. Her cold, numb fingers fumbled with the lock, the metal grating loudly in a brief lull in the wind. She froze, her heart in her throat. But the guard did not stir. She slipped inside the stockade walls. The jail was a low, squat building of stone and rough timber. Its single, iron-banded door was barred from the outside. She lifted the heavy bar, the muscles in her arms screaming in protest, and pushed the door open. The smell that hit her was overwhelming. A foul stench of sickness, filth, and despair. It was pitch black inside. Another flash of lightning lit the interior, and she saw him. He was chained to the far wall, slumped on the dirt floor. He was not just a prisoner. He was a ruin. His body was gaunt, his ribs starkly visible beneath his torn and bloodied skin. His face was a swollen, bruised mask, his hair matted with blood and dirt. He was so still she thought for a terrifying moment that she was too late. "Kohana," she whispered, her voice a broken thing. His head moved, a slight, almost imperceptible motion. He was alive. She knelt in the filth beside him, her hands hovering over his broken body, afraid to touch him for fear he might shatter. Tears streamed down her face, mingling with the rain. "I am so sorry," she wept, her voice choked with guilt and grief. "I am so sorry. I am here now. I will get you out." She cradled his head in her lap, her fingers gently brushing the matted hair from his forehead. His eyes fluttered open. They were dull with pain and fever, but in their depths, she saw a flicker of the man he was, a spark of recognition. His lips moved, but no sound came out. "Do not try to speak," she whispered, her voice fierce. "Save your strength." From the folds of her cloak, she pulled the item she had brought, a small, heavy key, purchased from a disgraced locksmith in the next town over, and a small, single-shot Derringer pistol, a weapon easily concealed in a lady's handbag, or the palm of her hand. She pressed the key into his hand, closing his weak fingers around it. "For the chains," she whispered. Then she showed him the pistol. "And this, if we need it." He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. It took all of his strength, but he managed to work the key into the lock of his shackles. It took an eternity, his movements slow and agonizing, but with a final, grinding click. The heavy iron cuffs fell away. He was free. Getting him to his feet was an ordeal. He was a dead weight, his body racked with shivers, his breath coming in shallow, rattling gasps. She put his arm over her shoulder, taking his weight, and they stumbled out of the cell and back into the raging storm. The escape was a frantic, desperate blur. They found 2 horses in the stockade's small corral, unsaddled and ready for the morning. There was no time for saddles or bridles. Clara helped push him onto the back of one, then scrambled onto the other. They rode bareback, clinging to the horses' manes, and galloped out of the open gate and into the dark, thundering night. They rode for hours, the storm their only ally, its fury covering their tracks and confusing their pursuers. But by dawn, the storm had passed, leaving a gray, washed-out world in its wake. And they heard it in the distance, the baying of hounds and the shouts of men. A posse was after them. Kohana was barely holding on. He was slumped forward, his body swaying with every step of the horse. He was dying, and he knew it. He reached out and grabbed her arm, his grip surprisingly strong. "Clara," he gasped, his voice a raw whisper. "You must leave me. They want me, not you. Go, you can still be free." She looked at him, at his bloodied, beloved face, at the unwavering loyalty in his eyes. She thought of her life before him, a gray, passionless existence, and the vibrant, terrifying, beautiful life she had known with him. Freedom without him was no freedom at all. She shook her head, her jaw set. "No," she said, her voice ringing with a conviction as powerful and as elemental as the storm they had just ridden through. She leaned closer, her eyes locking with his, making a vow that was more sacred than any she had ever uttered in a church. "We die together, or we live free." They pushed the horses harder, riding south, always south. The posse closed in, their shots echoing in the canyons behind them. They rode through a landscape of rock and thorn, a desolate no-man's land that seemed to stretch on forever. They were just at the edge of their endurance when they saw it. A line of simple, whitewashed buildings, nestled in a green valley. A cross rising from the roof of the largest, the borderlands, Mexico, an old mission. They stumbled into the courtyard, two ragged, bleeding refugees, and collapsed at the feet of an old priest with a kind, weathered face. He and his brothers took them in without question, seeing not a white woman and an Apache warrior, but two souls in desperate need of sanctuary. There, in the quiet, sun-drenched peace of the mission, Clara nursed him back to life a second time, slowly, painstakingly. She brought him back from the brink of death, his body healed, and in the deep, abiding peace of their sanctuary, his spirit began to heal as well. The ghosts of Willow Creek still visited him in his dreams, but their faces were softer now, their accusations quieter. The final scene is not one of violence or flight, but of a quiet, hard-won peace. Years have passed. The sun is warm on a small, modest cabin nestled among a grove of orange trees, their blossoms perfuming the air. Clara kneels in a garden, her hands no longer soft, but strong and capable, tending to rows of thriving corn and squash. Her face is weathered by the sun, and fine lines crinkle at the corners of her eyes when she smiles. A small boy with his mother's fair hair and his father's dark, serious eyes plays nearby, chasing a lizard in the dust. The sound of an approaching horse makes her look up. Kohana rides up the path, an axe resting on his shoulder, a load of firewood strapped to his saddle. He is older now, the lines on his face deeper, a tracery of silver in his black hair. The hunted look is gone from his eyes, replaced by a calm, steady light. He dismounts and walks to her. He does not speak. He simply reaches down and takes her hand, the one that bears the old scar and the simple wooden ring. Her hand is weathered and calloused, a match for his own. He lifts it to his lips and kisses it, a gesture of profound love and respect, a silent acknowledgement of all they have endured and all they have become. Their love, born of blood and tragedy, a fragile seedling in a world of stone, has survived. It has taken root and grown strong. And finally, in the warm, quiet sunshine, there is peace. Thank you for listening to our story around the campfire. We would love for you to comment with where you are listening from, so we can all connect. Be sure to subscribe to the Wild West Campfire channel for more tales from the frontier, and please share your thoughts with us in English.